and gentlemen, good afternoon. Could I thank you for your attendance, and we're very conscious that, firstly, probably all of you have made a real effort to get here today. Thank you, because at least on the South Coast line, the trains simply aren't running. So it's one of those very interesting days, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you have chosen to support us by your attendance, and thank you. I'm Michael Howe, the President, and could I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country, the Eora people of the Gadigal, and we acknowledge and respect the elders and pay credit to their occupancy and use of the land. It's been a fascinating year in which we have attempted, mostly successfully, to have people speak face-to-face or webcast using the theme of resilience. But today is slightly different, and I'd like to pay tribute to the fact that in December, have what we call the Sir Herman Black Oration, or the Sir Herman Black Lecture. Sir Herman Black was an extremely distinguished academic, and he was Chancellor of the University of Sydney for a very long period of time. For approximately 15 or so years. He was a very strong supporter of the Royal United Services Institute, New South Wales, and every year he initially just took it on himself that he would deliver what he called the Year in Review lecture. And he did this for many, many years, to the point where, quite frankly, it became an institution. We just expected that Sir Herman Black in December, I'm talking historically, would give the Year in Review lecture. Like all of us, he moved on, and he is no longer with us in that he died, but we honour Sir Herman by the fact that each December we have what is called the Sir Herman Black Lecture, and this particular year we're again honoured by, because Peter has in fact done it before for us, and in just a moment I'm going to ask our event coordinator, Lieutenant Colonel Ken Broadhead, if he could properly introduce Peter. And I'm also then going to ask our incoming event coordinator, because Ken, after 7, I think, years, has decided that, hey, enough is enough. And Ken is moving to another role within the Institute. And I'd like to pay tribute to the fact that Ken has organised these programs and done all of this for a very serious length of time. Thank you very much, Ken. And thank you. And the thank you to Peter is also going to be given by Lieutenant Colonel Ron Lyons. And Ron stepped backward too slowly, and he is taking Ken's place as the event coordinator. And we thank him very much for that. And at least, Ron, you realise it's at least 7 years' worth. I mean, you've always got to do better than your predecessor. But being more serious, could I just pay tribute to Ken, thank Ron for taking on that role. Could I now invite Lieutenant Colonel Ken Broadhead, our outgoing event coordinator, if he could introduce our guest speaker to deliver the Sir Herman Black Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, I should say that when I did Economics 3 many years ago, Sir Herman Black was a senior lecturer, and he used to give the most entertaining and erudite lectures I can remember. But I still remember the feeling of horror when I looked at the paper, because they seemed to be the questions seemed to bear no relationship to what he'd spoken about. But I had read the books and I scraped through. But he then went from senior lecturer to Chancellor, which remains a remarkable jump. Look, I'm honoured to introduce Peter Hartcher, who is one of Australia's best known and respected journalists, to deliver our Institute's 2021 Sir Herman Black Lecture. I was privileged in 2015 to introduce Peter as the lecturer for that year. He's political editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He's been writing about power and politics, war and peace, booms and busts for over 35 years, not just defence matters but economic and financial and political. He's a regular panellist on shows like Insiders and Q&A. His comments are always clear and authoritative and reflect his objectivity and insight. Peter began his career straight from school as a cadet reporter of the Herald. He's been a business reporter, Tokyo correspondent, endured service in the Canberra Press Gallery, and finally as chief political correspondent and bureau chief for the Herald. He moved to the Financial Review as Asia Pacific editor, and he's been Washington correspondent. He's won Australia's highest journalist award, a Gold Walkley Award, for reporting on how Australia secretly negotiated a security treaty with Indonesia. His comments in the Herald are always compelling and often scary. For example, recently he spoke about the dilemma that the US and its allies would have if China and Russia decided to coincide invasions of Taiwan and the Ukraine. He's appeared before parliamentary hearings to give testimony on our relationships with Asia. He's just published another major work, Red Zone, China's Challenge and Australia's Future. It's dedicated to Australia, a life raft of liberty in a rising tide of tyranny. That's a daunting metaphor, especially when I think of the word liberty. I can't think of the word liberty without recalling the RSL motto, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and I'm really not certain of the actual state of vigilance we've achieved. I should say we offer no guidance or requirement to our Sir Herman Black orator. The content is entirely for his or her judgment. We really appreciate Peter taking your time from your very busy life. Please join me in welcoming Peter Hartcher to deliver the 2021 Sir Herman Black Lecture.
Thank you, Ken, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for doing me the honour of turning out despite the train strike. And Ken, congratulations on doing the job that you've done, convening and organising. Organising me is not easy. I do have a busy life and a busy schedule, as you say, apart from the fact I've got 5 kids. There's also the fact that I generally operate in a state of chaos, like most journalists, you know, with daily deadlines and the usual chaos surrounding us. And I haven't been easy to manoeuvre, so well done, Ken, for persisting when others, lesser mortals, might have given up. The Herman Black Lecture, you'll be pleased to know, Ken, there will not be an exam after this one this year. I'm going to let you off lightly. And the dedication that you just read out from the dedication I wrote for this book, it is daunting. We live in a daunting time, I think. In fact, last year, I quote in the book Scott Morrison telling his staff privately that he said, look, an Australian Prime Minister at the moment has got a lot to worry about. I have to worry about the pandemic, I have to worry about the recession, depression, which was threatening, and I have to worry about China. He said, but the thing I worry about most of all, and spend most time worrying about, is China. I think we'll see that the other two were temporary challenges, and the China challenge is going to be an enduring one. I have to give you a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is that last month a former Prime Minister of Australia, a very serious fellow, described me as a ning-nong. So I want you to know that Paul Keating, when he addressed the National Press Club in Canberra, said that I was a ning-nong, which was new to me. I'd heard of nong. Nong's a good old one. I used to like to use that with the kids, but ning-nong, I hadn't heard those two put together. So thank you, Paul. Technically, he wasn't just addressing me as a ning-nong. He said that the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age were collectively inhabited by ning-nongs. I have to confess, though, I can't let all the colleagues wear it. I'm the one who writes most about Keating. I'm the one who's had the 35-year relationship with Keating. I'm the one who goes around town bad-mouthing. I have to cop the blame. I'm the ning-nong in chief at the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, where my work also appears. So now that we've got that disclaimer out of the way, Australia has come a long way on the China problem and Australia's own place in the world, I would suggest to you. And Keating himself is a marker of how far we've come. Just a few years ago, Keating was representing a very large and one of the mainstream viewpoints on Australia and its position with China. And his view, his long-standing view, from the time he was Prime Minister till now, has not changed. And that view essentially is that China is a great rising power that is entitled to greater strategic space. And therefore, as it rises, the other countries of the Asia-Pacific and the US in particular, but everybody, should fall back and allow China this increased strategic space. The basis for him saying that is that it's just a natural thing with a great rising power. Strikingly, nobody, including Keating, makes this apology or apologia for another great rising power in Asia with the same sort of population and a similar, now a much faster economic growth trajectory, and that's India. You don't hear people saying, oh, India's a rising great power, we've all got to stand back and make room and everybody's got to back off and Pakistan's got to back off and China's got to back off and let India flourish. Neither Keating nor anybody else says that. This is a this is a China-specific argument and an argument that the Chinese themselves have promulgated with great effect over the last 70 years, certainly the last 40 years. And you really have to give the Chinese Communist Party credit. If they're good at nothing else, they are masters at propaganda. Keating now represents a very small viewpoint in Australian debate. Among the elites of Australia, there's really only Keating left. He's really the only high-level defender and apologist for China left. Even the second tier one, Bob Carr, is a lot more cautious and careful in his utterances on this since leaving the Australia-China Research Institute, which he used to chair. He left that just weeks before the new Foreign Interference Bill took effect, which requires agents of foreign powers to list their names on a public register. So Bob avoided that fate. Bob's now an expert on climate change. At the same institution, at the UTS, where he was the chair of the Australia-China Institute, he's now at UTS as a professor, some sort of professor of climate change. A very timely change of expertise. Joe Biden, the US president, has said that securing, and I'm quoting Biden now, securing democracy is the defining challenge of our time. Securing democracy is the defining challenge of our time. And Australia just happens to find itself on the front line of this challenge, confronting the world's biggest and most assertive authoritarian state. Not by any plan of ours, of course, but by happenstance. I've been watching China very closely since I first went there, which was in the mid-80s. That was the reform era, where Deng Xiaoping was dominating and allowing economic reform to proceed and the market economy to operate. It was a very exciting time. He was Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1985, which happened to be the same year I first went there. And along with the economic reform, there was there's an explosion of cultural and social change and experimentation. There was an expression, the Chinese called it cultural fever, because there was so much new work going on in literature and the arts and academia. It was where mainland China produced its first rock and roll star. Then, of course, we hit Tiananmen Square, where the fever got a bit too much for the party to tolerate. I'm going to quote here Linda Javen. Linda Javen is an Australian sinologist and a very impressive one who's recently written a book called The Shortest History of China. And she talks about the post-Tiananmen generation of China. And I'll just quote a couple of sentences of her. She says, in fact, it's one sentence. If their parents were raised on class struggle, their older siblings tempted by dreams of democracy, the post-Tiananmen generation of Chinese are weaned on an aggrieved nationalism and a promise of economic opportunity. Then, under Xi Jinping, we see that the first part of that stepped up, and that is an aggrieved nationalism. He has traded on that. His first meeting of his, what we would call Cabinet State Council, was to take them on a public tour of an exhibition on the subject of China's century of humiliation at the National Museum in Beijing, and that was done in the full glare of the media. That was the launching pad for his presidency. It was an aggrieved nationalism. But the other thing Xi Jinping has done, if you take Linda Javin's formula there of the post-Tiananmen generations being weaned on aggrieved nationalism and the promise of economic opportunity, is that while he stepped up the aggrieved nationalism, gradually under his watch, not deliberately, but the economic opportunity has shrunk, and this last 12 months we see it shrinking faster than ever. The promise of economic opportunity has now dwindled rather desperately, and it's not just because of the pandemic and the economic contraction, it's this policy-driven crackdown that we see just in the last year on private capital and what the Chinese Communist Party campaigns against as what they call the disorderly expansion of capital. And just yesterday there was a senior official in Beijing gave a speech railing against what he called barbaric capital and increasingly building the case for why the private sector has to be brought down, controlled, and the reining in of the big Chinese tech companies in particular has been an absolute eye-opening episode in the humiliation of China's biggest, richest and most celebrated capitalists and entrepreneurs. The time when I started to seriously get worried about this whole Xi Jinping era, I can remember there was a very specific moment, and it was the time when I realised that if my mission as a journalist included helping Australia to see and understand what was going on in China, then I really had to step up my game. It was in 2017. There was a particular moment, a conversation I remember, and after this I decided I would write an essay which was published 2 years ago called Red Flag, and then that led to the book, which Ken mentioned, Red Zone. I was sitting down in the office of the secretary of a major federal government department, and I'd asked him to explain to me the debate that was going on internally within the then Turnbull government about the Huawei decision, the fact that the big Chinese telecommunications company was lobbying to get the contract to install the 5G telecommunications system in Australia. And the government was in an internal debate about whether to allow it or ban it. And this departmental secretary, Mandarin, was explaining to me the case for banning it, which was simply, it wasn't so much to do with espionage, it's a minor concern, it was simply the fact that if Huawei were operating our 5G system at any point on instructions from Beijing, Huawei would have to shut it down, and Australia would be left without its central nervous system in a time of crisis, at a time of Beijing's choosing. And once he'd explained this to me, I said, oh, so the solution's obvious. Australia's going to ban Huawei. And he said, I don't think that's going to happen. And I said, why not? I said, if it's that clear cut, why would we allow Huawei to operate the system? And his response was political will. He said, I don't think we've got the political will. That's when I started to get worried. And I thought that we can see the challenge. Our political leaders, from what the conversation I just heard, fully appreciated the risk, and yet were prepared to take that risk anyway. And that was the moment where I thought, you know, our liberty's on the line, and our sovereignty may be on the line. But since then, Australia, of course, has transformed beyond my wildest dream in confronting the danger. Kurt Campbell, whose name you might recognise as President Joe Biden's coordinator for the Indo-Pacific within the White House, the press calls him Biden's Indo-Pacific czar, is on the record saying recently that he thought, and others in elite US policy circles thought, that Australia was the country most likely to flip from the Western camp into China's sphere of influence. And you can see why. Australia was more dependent on the Chinese market than any other Western country. Just before the pandemic hit, Australia was depending on China for 48% of its export revenue, which we'd not been that dependent on any one country since Britain dumped us and went and joined the common market in 1973. But we didn't learn that lesson, and we built up an overweening dependence on one country again, yet this time it was a country we knew nothing about. And if the Brits were able to take us by surprise in 73, well, we really weren't prepared for China, a country whose political system we did not and still do not understand, a language we don't speak, and a leader that to this day we Westerners know very little about. And I'm hoping to address that a little bit later on today. But instead, and then by the way, a year into the pandemic, Australia's export dependency on China had gone from 48%, well over 50%. It was up to 50, 56, 57% because of the collapse of other economies while China was still growing. So even under trade sanctions to China, our economic dependence on China was still growing, believe it or not. And yet despite that, what we see is not an Australia flipping to the Chinese sphere of influence and abandoning the West and the US alliance. Consider what's happened since that moment of what I thought, that critical moment of decision for Australia in 2017, when we were on the cusp of banning Huawei or allowing Huawei. It's hard to believe that in that same year, 2017, the federal parliament was still debating whether to strike a deal with China on an extradition treaty. You'll remember the Turnbull government was proposing the treaty. Labor was hesitating. It ended up being blocked in the Senate because Labor insisted on some changes which the government wasn't prepared to make, and that died. But can you imagine, at the same time that this debate was going on about Huawei, the government was still pushing for an extradition treaty. And of course, it was the extradition treaty between Hong Kong and mainland China that started those big protests in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, in response to which we know the unhappy ending. But instead of flipping, to use Kurt's term, from the US to the Chinese sphere of influence, look back over those 4 years, what's happened? Well, of course, the federal government banned Huawei. It was Turnbull's last decision, and a decision of which Morrison was part as Treasurer. Australia has introduced the EFI and FITS laws, espionage and foreign interference laws. It's entered a political freeze, of course, at the top level political contact with Beijing. We've were famously the first country to call for an independent inquiry into the COVID epidemic and its origins. Australia is one of the 4 members of the Quad arrangement, which has now been elevated by Joe Biden to the summit level for the first time, and had its first summit level and person-to-person leaders meeting just a few months ago in September. Australia is one of the 3 countries to create the new AUKUS security agreement, which is a fundamental and absolutely decisive repudiation of China as an alternative source for the Australian future or sphere of influence, and an emphatic restatement of confidence and dependence on the US as well as the UK, of course. And Australia is one of the 5 countries so far to impose a diplomatic boycott on the Beijing Winter Olympics, as well as declaring a Pacific Step Up, which is what Morrison calls it, which has involved the Australian government working very actively in a chess game to try and counter Chinese intrusions and manipulations and influence building in the South Pacific. Most recent iteration of which was announced just on Sunday, when Australia, Japan and the US announced that it would be building and financing an undersea internet cable or high fibre optic cable to connect 3 Pacific Island countries, specifically so that the Chinese government and Huawei would not be building the same cable for those countries. And in the meantime, Australia, under trade sanctions, the cost of which is anywhere between $20 billion a year to the Australian economy and $50 billion a year, depending on exactly how you measure it. Australia, not just the government, but critically, the Labor Party as well, is standing very firm on the 14 demands that the Chinese government has handed to to Australia in November last year. A puzzling question that many Australians still ask is why has Australia been inadvertently put on the forefront, made an example of? Why is Australia being disciplined and made an example of in this way by China, by Beijing? Sure, Beijing has been punishing and pursuing many countries and abusing a growing list of countries, but it has made a specific point about trying to tame Australia and break Australia's sovereign will, which is what that list of 14 demands is all about. Excuse me one second. Well, very briefly, we know from a Chinese diplomat who defected to Australia, Chen Yonglin, who was just down here in Surrey Hills, was the political counsellor at the Chinese consulate. He defected, and in 2005, he went on the record to say that the Chinese government, the senior leadership had decided to begin the long-term infiltration of Australia because it was seen as the, quote, weak link in the Western camp. Now, that was a collective decision of the Chinese government leadership long before Xi Jinping became leader. And 2005, I mean, if we'd been listening, we had plenty of notice. Of course, we completely disregarded it. So that's the first. Beijing saw us as a prime target, a weak link, and that was a top leadership decision. Second, of course, is that Australia is a US ally and that it would be a powerful precedent if it could demonstrate that even a close US ally was prepared to leave the US camp and move to the Chinese sphere of influence. And of course, going along with the US alliance, a critical strategic asset such as Pine Gap, which is essential to the US early missile warning system, as well as the Harold Holt base, which it's essential to its communications with its submarines, US submarines, and so on. Third is the fact that Australia, as a landmass in its position on the planet and its political and diplomatic footprint, has strategic value in itself. Its positioning between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, its closeness to Indonesia, PNG, the Malacca Straits, and its influence over and access to Antarctic. The Chinese government is busy building pseudo-scientific bases in Antarctica, which are all part of its plan, as well, of course, as you know, operating in space and planning a permanent base on the moon. So taking all of the level of US and Russian achievements and adding an entirely new layer of technological achievement and political ambition, imperial ambition, I should add. The fourth reason that Australia has been targeted is because Australia is essential to the Chinese aim of hegemony in the Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, however you want to define it. And that is the reason, the same reason, that we now find countries on the other side of the planet, we now find the European Union and even NATO identifying China as the greatest strategic threat to NATO, to Europe, to the US, to London. I mean, look at the map. Although a British diplomat pointed out to me recently that measured by kilometre for kilometre, London is closer to Beijing than Canberra is, but let's set that aside for a minute. The rest of the world has awoken to the same realisation that Australia has, not because they're in a direct geographic line of threat, not because they're subject to the concept of invasion or missile strike, but because of the same essential, fundamental judgment that China has made, that Australia is essential to the Chinese goal of Pacific hegemony. The bloke who was the lead author of the US National Defence Strategy in 2018, it was the most recent one, drafted by for the Trump administration, a fellow called Eldridge Colby, has explained the logic behind that national defence strategy, which also identifies China as the primary strategic threat to the US interests. He has described, Eldridge Colby has described the essence of the China threat as being its ambitions for hegemony in the region. And why is that important? he says we have to deny hegemony to China because hegemony over Asia, which is already most of the world's economy, is the only conceivable way, says Colby, that China could generate enough power to coerce and dominate the United States itself. That if China is allowed to achieve its goal of hegemony in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, however you want to define it, that it would generate enough economic weight and therefore enough diplomatic and geopolitical weight that it ultimately would be in a position to threaten the US itself with coercive power and therefore political power. So Australia has resisted beyond my wildest imaginings in a solid bipartisan manner out of both the Liberal and National and Labor parties, gratefully, for which, by the way, the Australian public gets first credit because the public was already there. A huge majority of the Australian people was already expressing concern of Chinese influence in Australia and dominance and attempts to coerce even before Turnbull had banned Huawei. So the public was there first. Turnbull has to get credit as being the first Prime Minister to take a tough confrontational decision openly against Huawei. But the rest of the country has followed, and that's everybody except for Paul, of course. What would I know? I'm just a ning-nong, but the rest of Australia has left Paul in a phone booth of his own factional position on this. There's just him and Bob. Must be cosy in that phone booth sometimes. I'll just briefly remind you the implication of that list of 14 demands that two nameless Chinese diplomats handed to a colleague of mine at Nine, I can say it now, I work for Nine Entertainment. I used to work for Fairfax, now I work for Nine Entertainment. Jonathan Kearsley, the diplomat said, this is the list. These are our 14, they call them grievances, demands on Australia, but don't use our names. They were that proud of what they were doing. And there was no letterhead or anything like that, just a sheet of 14 typewritten demands. Not only were they not proud of what they were doing, I think they were deliberately keeping it in a non-official status to allow them to withdraw graciously and deny its official status if it should later become obvious that it was a mistake. So they were... We'll come back to that. If Australia were to meet the 14 demands, we would have to hand control of our foreign investment laws to Beijing, because that's their first demand. That's the first demand, is control the foreign investment regime, so that they decide which foreign investments are made in Australia, not us. Second, we would have to hand over control of our telecommunications laws, our foreign interference and espionage laws, our visa policy. Australia would have to muzzle its media. It would have to censor its MPs and senators. It would have to be silent in commentary on the world affairs generally, and China in particular. Australia would have to abandon the international treaties it's ratified on the rights of overflight and rights of navigation, and of course never criticise China. That's what Australia would have to do to satisfy the 14 demands. When Paul Keating appeared at the National Press Club and was asked repeatedly by that same reporter who received the list from the Chinese embassy, Jonathan Kearsley, which of those demands would you accede to, Mr. Keating? Keating skirted the question the first two times. The third time it was asked, he said, I think you'd find... Oh, that must be Paul on the line now. Give him my love. He said, what you'd find is, if we gave China enough respect, those 14 demands, they would sort of, this is an exact quote, they would sort of fall off the table. In other words, if we capitulated sufficiently, they wouldn't have to worry, because they'd control our sovereignty anyway. Thanks, Paul. A fellow called Rush Doshi, who was a China specialist at the Brookings Institution, who's now in the Biden White House. He's the China section head on Biden's National Security Council. At the time of those 14 demands, this is what he had to say about the 14 demands. He said, the deployment of coercive, and the trade sanctions that went with them, of course, the deployment of coercive economic leverage to shape Australia's internal behaviour is a kind of illiberal order building. The list of 14 demands is a partial guide to the norms of that illiberal order. It was the Chinese blueprint, the Chinese Communist Party blueprint, for what countries, all countries, should do and how they should behave towards China. And I have been unbelievably heartened at the solidarity with which Australia has rejected those demands and stood firm, regardless of the best Chinese efforts to influence and inflict pain. Rather than Australia wilting, if anybody is having doubts about this strategy, it's Beijing. You might remember Scott Morrison took copies of the 14 to a G7 meeting that Australia was invited to by the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. I'm not sure whether he'd invite us back just now, but Morrison handed out copies of the 14 demands to the other G7 leaders, and he said, look at this. This is what the Chinese were demanding. And from what we've heard, most of them hadn't actually read the list and were astonished and expressed that to Morrison at the nature and the sheer effrontery of the Chinese government's effort. And Morrison has said, in announcing the AUKUS deal and within that the submarine component, that defence spending in Australia, currently hovering around 2% of GDP, is going to have to go way beyond the 2% mark. So Australia hasn't hesitated or doubted, but colleagues in Canberra tell me that there is a counsellor from the Chinese embassy who in recent weeks, fairly newly arrived, this particular counsellor in Australia from Beijing, who is taking quiet informal soundings about whether Australia would meet, maybe not all the demands, but maybe there are just some that Australia would be able to meet. There's clearly a rethink. The thing has backfired badly, and even within the Chinese system, they're now looking for face-saving ways to maybe retreat or somehow navigate away from that, what for them is a disastrous position because it's exposed their relative impotence, even when they delivered what they thought would be a killer blow against the weak link. Joe Biden has said, and I'm running out of time, I don't think I'm going to get a chance to read to you from my stunningly brilliant prose. I was going to tell you the personal backstory to Xi Jinping's childhood and rise, because I just think it's an amazing story. But I've been too long-winded with this part, so I'm not going to get to that. You'll be relieved to know. I'm not going to read to you from my book. Joe Biden has said, democracy needs champions. Democracy needs champions. Well, the shock development is that Australia didn't think it was going to be the leading champion, and yet we are one of the leading champions of democracy in the face of this rising authoritarianism. And the US, the biggest shock of all, is that rather than being the democratic leader, has become a democratic backslider, where the former president still to this day has not acknowledged the election result. To this day, Donald Trump remains the most likely or the most publicly supported, according to polling, candidate for the Republican Republican candidacy for the White House. And as long as that's the case, and as long as many, many millions of Americans agree with him, then democracy is still in the balance in the United States of America. And the burden on Biden's shoulders at the moment is it's almost mind-boggling. He's like Atlas bearing the planet on his shoulders. He not only has to try to save democracy in the United States, but he has to defend against or deny the rising autocracies of China and its increasingly close friend, Russia. Scott Morrison is just one of the people who've drawn parallels between 1920s and 30s, catastrophic economic collapse, followed by the rise of global fascism, and today. But the parallels are pretty easy to see. The democracies of the world have been complacent, finally jolted into paying attention by the onrushing rise of great fascist powers, and I don't think it's an overstatement to call China a fascist power. In fact, I used that description in print a few years ago. I was flattered when the Chinese Foreign Ministry held a press conference to call for my immediate sacking Gratefully, we still have freedom of speech in Australia, and I should also acknowledge that the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, now owned by Nine Entertainment, have been absolutely steadfast in protecting journalistic independence and free speech. It's a precious commodity that we're still protecting, thank God. In short, there's a titanic struggle to preserve human liberty once again in the world. Now, I am at time, so I'll just make the point that the story so far in terms of Australia's response is pretty good. But I just make one final point, is that we are, having taken this position, struck this national stance of resolve and defiance, and tightened our partnership with the US, as well as the UK, Japan, India, and others, we are nonetheless exposed. If there is a problem with the US, it doesn't have to be the collapse of democracy, but just a future government that doesn't have the same commitment to its allies that the current administration does, then we are exposed. We don't have the wherewithal to defend ourselves in many ways. Those submarines are a long time coming, the nuclear-propelled ones on promise under the auspices of the AUKUS deal. As Macron delighted in pointing out to Australian reporters, congratulations guys, all you've got is a working group for the next 18 months. I don't think Xi Jinping is going to be very daunted by a working group. So while we've taken the political and strategic decision, we've yet to equip ourselves fully, and I'm not just talking about conventional material and hardware, I'm talking in the fuller suite of national independence to defend ourselves. And that's really the best I can make of things as a ning-nong. If you want a more expert view, you'll have to invite Paul Keating around next year. Thank you.
Peter, on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. As our life raft of liberty peaks its way over the top of the wave, you've given us some very insightful and thought-provoking looks at what that might look like in the future, and we certainly hope that you'll come back and talk with us again. So on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to present this token of our